right, Aftershocks, Tremors, we are back with another discussion episode today, and we've got a great one today, folks. That all of you early thrash metal fans are going to definitely love this one. We're going to go behind the scenes and do some studio talk with one of the most iconic producers in metal history. He's, of course, most well known for being behind the glass for one of metal's all-time classic records, Megadeth's Peace Cells, but who's buying? We've got the legendary Randy Burns with us today. Randy, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and speak with us. How are you, man?
I'm good. I'm good. Nice to be here.
Yeah, great, man. Well, thanks. Well, yeah, it's quite the honor to get to chat with you. Just to give our listeners a brief overview of your career and what records and bands you've worked with. For ones that don't know or aren't familiar with your resume, obviously, Peace Cells was your crown achievement that really made you one of the most sold out go-to guys for many crossover thrash and death metal bands during the mid to late 80s. But you've also worked on numerous genre-defining records, from the debut self-titled Suicidal Tendencies record to Death, Scream, Bloody Gore, Possessed Seven Churches, records from Dark Angel, Nuclear Soul, Crumb Suckers. I mean, it's just a behemoth of a resume you got, man. And, what's so unique about your career, Randy, as I was doing my due diligence here to prepare for this interview, is that, as a studio guy, unlike most studio professionals who, earn their chops in the studio at a gradual pace, that was something that you never had to experience. You were hitting home runs from day one. From the minute you dipped your toe into the music business waters, you were making these legendary records right out of the gate. So, I guess my first question is, what was it when you were, selecting these artists to work with? Because one of the things about you is, you've got such a high percentage of classic records with all, with basically the amount of records you've produced. It's not like you're not like a typical producer who, the law of averages, you could obviously hit some home runs here and there. Pretty much most of the records you did were just all home runs. So my first question is, what was it that drew you to those specific bands, and records when you decided what to work on and who to work with back in the 80s there?
Well, actually, it was more the other way around, that I did a lot of work with Combat Records, and there was a guy there named Steve Sinclair.
Okay.
And Steve Sinclair was doing the A&R for Combat, and I did a few records for him, and I just became his go-to guy. And almost all those records that you just mentioned came through Steve at Combat.
Wow. Okay.
There was another guy, Ron Gowdy, at Enigma Records. And then at some point, well, I guess after Peace Cells, then a lot of the bands sought me out. So I had a management company that kind of filtered things, and it was, here's a bunch of bands, they all want to be produced. Which one do you want to work with? And I would pick them. Some of them were obvious, like Creator. It just made sense that they were already established bands. But on the beginning, that big run in the middle there with Possessed and Death and Megadeth and even
Nuclear Assault, right?
All that stuff came through Steve Sinclair at Combat.
Wow, very cool. Well, go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's it.
Okay. Well, I was going to say, I just want to let's start with your career really as you started out as a youngster in the LA punk scene. The first record you worked on was a punk compilation called "Hell Comes to Your House." Now compilation albums are a dime a dozen, but you wound up working on this one. I read that it cost just over $500 to make, and it featured a song from a little Southern California band called Social Distortion. So even the comp you worked on featured one of the biggest punk bands in history. Do you chalk a lot of your success up to simply, it just basically it's because of, obviously, like I said, Steve, obviously fed you a lot of these bands, but was it simply, especially in the early days, with that record, of course, later on when you worked with Suicidal Tendencies on their self-titled debut, was a lot of it just being really at the right place at the right time? Or do you think you had to do with, what was it that really, how were you able to, especially right off the bat, be able to work with these iconic bands, that want to become, especially in the punk rock scene, some of the biggest punk rock bands in history?
It was kind of being in the right place at the right time. I think I was really, extremely fortunate to sort of get a ride on two scenes. One was the LA punk scene, where I did the Hell Comes to Your House. And then that got me the gig with Lisa Fancher at Frontier to do Suicidal.
Mm-hmm.
And so I sort of caught a ride there. I was just right there when everything was happening. And then the beginning of the thrash metal scene with Megadeth and all those other bands. So yeah, there really is an element of just being in the right place at the right time.
Very cool.
And but of course, you know, there was a guy I worked with a lot in Hollywood called the Drum Doctor. He was a drum tech who rented drums, and I used him a lot for my stuff. And he used to say that in Hollywood the same guys were showing up all the time to do the work. So I was there. I did a whole lot of bands that weren't hit records.
Okay.
And, those are the exception. So you have to be there and you have to be ready when the time comes.
Sure, absolutely. Well, it seems like most of the iconic producers in the world of punk and metal really started exactly like you did. I mean, they had no real, from what I read, I remember it said that you really had no aspirations of really becoming a studio guy at the time. I mean, and like a lot of these other producers, they were basically musicians who simply, were recording their friends' bands in their basement or garage, just a good old DIY punk rock approach to recording. And that's how it started for a lot of the engineers and producers at that time, especially in the 80s there when working on punk and metal records. I mean, at what point did you realize that what you were doing was more than just a little, side thing where you were helping your fellow musician friends, and you were actually, really good at this and could make it a career? I mean, did you even want it to be a career, being that I know later on temporarily removed yourself from the industry after you did the Seven Churches Possessed record?
I was playing club bands in Orange County, playing what we call top 40. We had two girls in our club band, and we did Patti Benatar and Pretenders and Fleetwood Mac, and then on the heavier side, AC/DC and Journey, things like that.
Okay.
And at the same time I was doing that, I put together an 8-track studio in my garage at my parents' place in Long Beach, and started recording. And then somebody heard about that, and a punk band came over, and I recorded a punk band there, and they told their friends, and that's really how I got started in the recording thing. But what got me into it seriously was just trying to get out of playing clubs for a living and to do the recording thing for a living. So my girlfriend and I and my partner, Linda Schultz, we opened up this little 8-track studio in La Brea in Orange County.
Okay.
And that's where I did Hell Comes to Your House.
Oh.
And while I was doing that, Linda and I had an original band. And again, sort of in that somewhere between Fleetwood Mac and Heart, kind of poppy rock stuff of the late 70s, early 80s variety. We got signed to a management deal, and basically they signed us to a record deal, and then they were trying to sell that record deal to a major label. And the thing went south. The drummer for the band was Mark Jubé, who quit our band and joined Survivor.
Okay.
And it became really messy. The management company wanted me to sue Mark for breach of contract.
Oh, jeez.
and I wouldn't do it. So they fired me as well. And I literally was in an office in Hollywood with this Hollywood entertainment lawyer and the management company, and telling me that I would never work in this town again, blah, blah, blah. So I was really, anyway, so it's kind of getting long-winded, but it was, I gave up on the record company artist thing at that point, decided to just move to Hollywood and work in the recording industry for a while. I just was burnt out on the whole trying to get a record company deal.
Sure. What was that a difficult decision, Randy? Because I know you musicians, you get that bug and you always sort of have that bug.
I don't know. I was a little bit tired and jaded from working in clubs for a long time. That gets to be a real drag after a while. I don't know how many musicians you've talked to about that.
Sure.
And then, like I said, the original band thing didn't, with the management company was real. I don't know, it's just disturbing and irritating and made me cynical. So I just wanted to get away from it for a while, honestly. And once I got into Hollywood and got into working in the studio, I really liked it. And I just stayed there and things just sort of happened.
Sure.
I got busy and it didn't take long before I was producing records. So
sure. Well, you've obviously done amazing things with that decision, so it was obviously the right decision to make. Now, I want to pull the curtain back a little bit on production and specifically on yours, because the one thing that jumps out to me about when you look at your catalog, especially that 80s run, I guess we'll call it 80s to mid 90s ish run, you did a lot of records that don't sound a lot alike, which to me is an absolute testament to you. They really have different production qualities from record to record that sort of match the bands, which I guess is the goal.
right.
But for you, when you go into a record, no matter who it is, do you have a sound in mind based off of the band you're working with and the demos, or do you have a predetermined sound of what you want to capture and bring that to the band? Does that make sense?
I consider my style to be very documentary.
Okay.
I think that the band is the best authority on how they should sound, and that my job is to translate their vision of what they want to sound like into reality. So no, I don't go in with a predetermined, like, this is the sound I'm going for. I go in and try to get the best that I can out of that particular band. So I used to tell bands that if they use me, their record would sound exactly like them, only 1,000 times better than they ever thought possible.
Nice.
That was the goal,
Sure.
In my management company times, I had an experience where I recorded the demos for my band, and that's how I got the management deal.
Right.
And so the management company said, well, you need to have some 24 track demos. We're going to hire a producer and send you in the studio to make some demos. And they did. And I really, really hated them. I really didn't like them. They missed something.
Right.
They went in there, and I listen to it now and I see exactly what they were trying to do, and but it wasn't the sound of my band. It was a different sound. And I was really disappointed and angry and frustrated with that when I was the artist and the producer did something else, right?
Right.
They got the sound that they thought we needed to have and not the one that I wanted. So that really stuck with me. And so when I went into the studio with original bands, I was really, really focused on getting the sound that they wanted and trying to understand what that was and translate things the best I could. So.
No doubt. Is it helpful or a hindrance as the producer to have the other band guys that are not working, that are, kind of on the couch in the studio? And what I mean specifically is, obviously you've worked with having the musicians with you, but sometimes, I've sat in with local bands mostly, so it's a different environment, obviously, but I've sat in, and whoever's not working tends to be distracting, whether it's their horse playing around, or they're doing whatever, or they're noodling around on their guitar while you're trying to do drum tracks or whatever. For you, did you keep everybody out, or were you happy to have them in there if they were paying attention, trying to give you some assistance with what they were trying to capture, or what?
It just depends. I think vocals, as a producer, one of the important parts of your job is to decide when it's a take.
Okay.
So you're in there and you're recording and you're listening to them and they're performing. and you really have two jobs as a producer. One is to get the good performance, and then two is to know when that's it, that's the one, that's the take, stop now, and we're going to move on. So I think particularly with vocals, a lot of times I would have everybody leave, so that the vocalist, it was just me and the vocalist and an engineer, or just me and the vocalist in the studio. And but other times, you know, the right atmosphere might be more of a party atmosphere, and I'd have, you know, the band in there drinking beer and cheering the guy on, right?
Sure.
You know, and have it, you know, get a lot of positive feedback from him, you know, when the guy did something good. So it just depends on the situation.
Okay.
But that is part of your job, is to control that.
Sure.
And the goal is to get the good performance. You know, how do you get the performer in the right space and the right frame of mind to give the best performance, and then knowing when you got it.
Right.
Those are your two main jobs.
Sure. Well, you seemingly were an expert at controlling it, just because when you look at the list of bands that you worked with, all of them at the same time that they were at their creative peak were also at their partying peak. You know, Megadeth certainly was, Nuclear Assault certainly was.
Right.
I mean, all these bands were at their partying peak. Was it difficult to navigate their excesses, you know, or control it to, like you said, that sometimes you'd make it a party atmosphere? Was it hard to get them not to be in a party atmosphere and actually come ready to work?
You know, all of these bands were really serious, and this was their big shot. You know, it was almost always the first album with a label, and the label was paying for it, and they were very, very serious about what they were doing. So they weren't goofing off or mucking around in the studio. They were there to get the record done, and so I was very serious about staying focused on getting the work done. And no, it's not really a problem. It's not really, it wasn't really an issue. I can't remember when, you know, I can remember no situations where it's like, well, we can't do any more recording because so-and-so's drunk or whatever, something like that. I mean, it just didn't happen. I also think a lot of people have the misconception that, you know, if people are doing drugs, that they're not able to perform.
True.
Those two things are, you know, that's not really true. Some people perform really well when they're high. So it just depends, you know. So anyway, it wasn't, people doing drugs and drinking wasn't really a hindrance to making the record.
Oh, very interesting. Very cool. Well, let's get to, you know, just talking about some of the obviously some of your history here. I mean, right around the time that you were working on the Suicidal Tendencies debut is really when punk and metal were, you know, they were starting to slowly cross-pollinate with each other. I mean, Institutionalized was an alternative radio hit. I mean, and what separated, I think, that song, especially that album too, from the other punk and hardcore, you know, bands at the time, was the lead guitar. They had this, you know, immensely talented lead guitarist, Rocky George. And that was just something that really went against that whole punk rock ethos musically. Was, you know, they didn't believe in lead guitarist punk rock. And I mean, and that level of musicianship in punk, it just wasn't, like I said, it just wasn't happening at the time. And of course, the coalescing of punk and metal eventually led to the crossover, you know, movement, which you as a producer helped establish greatly. As a producer and engineer, you know, in general, I know you were an engineer on that record, but just a producer in general, I mean, how were you able to tap into or convince a lot of those punk-centric bands at the time to adapt, you know, a more metallic sound when there was such, you know, consternation between both the punk and metal scenes? Because I mean, both scenes, especially I know, you know, in New York on the East Coast, both scenes, they were like oil and water. I mean, they hated each other, you know. So as a producer, did you have to twist any arms and do a lot of convincing for a lot of these bands to adapt to a more integrated sound of combining both of those subgenres together at the time?
No, they did
Really?
it themselves.
Okay,
Suicidal
wow.
Tendencies is the perfect example. They were, when they came into the studio, visually, you had three guys with bandanas that looked like they were in gangs, And then you had this other guy with a Les Paul and a Marshall and, hair down to here, right?
Right.
And it literally looked like they were from two different worlds and they were in the same band. But that's what the band was. It was the merging of those, the fusion of those two different things. And they did it. It was, wasn't me guiding them. I just did a good job of putting it on tape.
Yeah. No, sure did, man. Well, I mean, well, the one thing you would know, I mean, obviously, just as much as anybody, is really the difference too between the two coasts where the crossover sound was emanating from both LA and New York. I mean, from my just knowledge, from what I've learned is, obviously with the New York crossover scene, that really didn't come into fruition really until SOD came out with Speak English or Die. That was one of the big records that helped kickstart that back there, which helped bridge that gap, obviously, with both subgenres. But it did take some time to get to that point. But on the West Coast, you really had the Venice scene, obviously, with Suicidal and No Mercy, Excel, later on with Uncle Slam. I mean, when did you start to notice in the studio and working with these bands that these two styles were indeed starting to become, aligned with each other in a natural sense without any, label input or any influences that came from the business perspective? Because, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure Combat eventually at the time, and just independent labels in general, were probably welcoming or wanting more of that metal and punk to come together in order to really reach a broader, audience, which of course means more record sales and ticket sales and return on their investment.
Well, I think Suicidal was, really at the beginning of this coming together of the two different styles.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time you get, and then, Excel was probably, 90% rock with 10% of the punk.
Mm-hmm.
And then Uncle Slam, they're just a thrash band. I mean, in my opinion, they were fully there into the metal world. So, I don't know. Again, I took each band as they came and tried to do what that band was trying to accomplish. And I really, never as a producer went into the studio to try to push a band in one direction or another or tell them what to be. I was always trying to look for, what is it you guys are doing that's different? And let's put the spotlight on that. And let's make this record, make this record unique. So
sure, yeah,
and of course they were very different. The Uncle Slams and Excel would be really, really, really different than Ludacris and the Crumb Suckers. Those were
oh yeah,
really, really different guys too.
Sure.
Right.
No,
the New York guys are really very personable and
Sure.
really interesting, fun to be around.
Mhm.
Not that the other guys weren't, but I mean, it was a whole different thing. I wasn't used to the New York thing. So
Got
Sure.
it. No, totally. Well, I mean, the thing too, Randy, that really impresses me, about your career is obviously that you worked on these extreme death metal classics too, like Death and Possess, records, and this that genre was obviously at the time really brand spanking new, and although both bands had legendary, guitarists in both Chuck and Larry Lalonde, as good as these guys were at the time at their craft, I'd have to venture a guess that they were also probably not as obviously precise as they would become later on. I mean, also that you're, from a punk rock background where, precision is, like I said, it's pretty negative in the punk world, missing notes and playing off key. That sort of adds to the character of the music of punk. But the same, really can't be said with metal. It's always, with metal, it's always been the exact opposite, where precision and perfection is like the ultimate goal with guitar players, and it's heralded, unlike punk rock. So with those two bands of guitars, and just, I guess, in general, I mean, especially when it came to tracking the guitars, I mean, how much of an adjustment was it for you as an engineer and producer when it came to tracking the guitars from the punk bands to the more seasoned players in those extreme metal bands? I mean, was it more, say, difficult to work with the Chuck and Larrys because of their desire to be, great at their craft and be legends as guitars? Or was it more frustrating and challenging working with the punk-related bands who weren't seeking out to be, guitar gods? Because as a producer, I mean, it's obviously, your job to challenge and get the best you can out of them, even if it wasn't something that, they weren't really desiring or seeking to do.
Well, I I recorded those bands differently, and the punk bands would pretty much record live, and then maybe we would overdub the vocals.
Okay.
But we would do everything else live, you know, guitar, bass, and drums would all be live with the vocals singing with them until we got a good take where we had everybody. And there was no double tracking guitar parts on the punk stuff. So we were just looking for a good take and a good performance and trying to get a good sound. I tried to record the punk guys just like I would the metal guys. I mean, it didn't make any difference to me. You know, I was trying to get a high fidelity sound out of both of them, you know. But in terms of exactly how you recorded them, the you know, Death and Possessed, we would assemble things a little differently. We would go in and have everybody play, and we were only looking to really keep the drums, or maybe the drums and some of the bass, maybe go fix the bass. But the bass and the guitars, we would overdub in the control room, playing to the good drum performance. And it was building the tracks up with a lot more overdubs and really working really hard to get the double track guitar tight. That's a big part of it. Of getting a good sound is to have those guitar performances be really tight. So that would be the difference, you know.
Okay.
No double tracking on the punk stuff. You do it all live. The faster metal stuff, you know, you have to go in and overdub the guitars and work through it a section at a time to get the really tight double track. First, you get the first track really tight with the drums, and then the second track you get really tight with the first one, and that gives you that that metal sound that makes sense.
Sure. I just to be clear on what you're saying there about the punk bands, when you say that you had them record live to get a take, do you mean that you had them keep playing it until you got one take with all of them at the same time, or did you split the tracks and then piece together each until they all fit?
No, we wanted to get the whole thing, except maybe for the vocal. We could go back and redo the vocals. We go back and work through and overdub the vocals, but nothing else usually. Maybe overdub a guitar or something like that, some of the stuff, but most of the stuff was really not very produced. But the guitar, bass, drums, we get all that live. We get the basic track live. And I didn't double track. I didn't double track the guitars. Those guys were not into that.
They didn't want it, right?
They're not going to do that, you know.
Right.
Capture the performance and we're good, you know.
No question. Well, Randy, I got to tell you up front, I'm a failed drummer, so I'm asking this question as an absolute failure of a drummer. So, but you know, I always think as somebody that's, you know, been watching music and wishing I could do it for 40 years or whatever, I always think that recording wise, the most important player is the drummer, because he keeps everything kind of in time, moving forward at the direction you want it to be. Is that the truth for you when you bring a band in, that the better the drummer is, the better the session will be, because the drummer keeps everything paced correctly?
To a great extent, yes. And when I did the thrash metal bands, I would always do it the same way. I would set up all of the bands, but we would focus on the drums. To do the drum tracks, I would go into the big studio, Music Grinder, the expensive studio,
right,
and rent drums. I used to rent drums from a guy named the Drum Doctor I mentioned before.
Right.
And what he would do is he would bring in a kit that matched the kit of the drummer in the band. So if he had 2 toms and 2 floor toms and then 2 crashes here and a hat, he would bring in exactly the same number of drums and put them in exactly the same place and set them up. So when the drummer sat down, we'd use the drummer's pedals, and it would be exactly like the drummer's kit, except all the drums would be different.
Oh, wow.
All the drums would be these really specialized hand beaded heads, you know, really beautiful drums that just sounded fantastic. So we would set up all the band. We'd have the bass and the guitars and everybody going, and a singer Sometimes with the thrash metal guys, they don't need to sing. They just play it. They just play it. They don't need the vocals there. But when you had sometimes they did. Anyway, we would set up and play through the songs, and the performance I was looking for was just the drums. So when we got a great drum performance, then that would be the take on that, and we'd move on to the next song to get the next drum performance. And we'd stay in the big studio for maybe 2 days, maybe 3 days doing that, and then go into a small studio that was much cheaper.
Sure.
To record guitars and vocals, because you can record guitars and vocals anywhere, you know, and they're going to sound the same. Whereas drums, you need to have the room, you need to have the really good microphones, and I think you need to have really good drums, you know. So, yeah, drums are really, really important, and we would build it up there. You start with the drums, then you do the bass, then you do the guitars, then you do the vocals.
Okay, very cool, man. Well, Randy, let's talk about the big one that everybody knows. Let's talk a little bit about Peace Cells. That's obviously it's the one everybody knows. It's the one people go back and forth between Peace Cells and Rust in Peace as Megadeth's mega moment, you know, which has to be a mark of pride for you, you know, because you guided them in exactly the right direction at the right time. For you personally, how do you look at that release? And, you know, because there was a lot of negative for you that came after it initially came out. So how do you look at it, you know, as far as how it came out when it was done, how it came out when Capitol did the, Paulini remix or whoever did the mix? Give us kind of an overview of that whole period, because it is a strange story on one of the greatest albums ever.
Well, I don't know if it's that strange of a story. Again, I wasn't actually in Hollywood working when that record came up. I was taking a break from Hollywood. I was living with my parents in Antelope Valley out in the desert, and going to school and studying computer science. And I was sort of sick of Hollywood and the music business. And Steve Sinclair called me and said, I have this band and you have to produce the record.
Okay.
You know, you have to do it. And I'm like, well, all right, Steve, okay, I'll listen to them. So I went down to listen to them in a rehearsal studio in downtown LA in this small little room. And I sat down and they played about 8 songs in a row. No vocals, just the band.
Okay.
And I knew right then that it was a hit record. And I quit school.
Wow.
Rented an apartment in Hollywood, took the gig, and made the record. So, for me, it was, it was a point, an inflection point in my career. So, like I said, I was taking a break at the time.
Sure.
And it was just, again, it was being in the right place. Those guys just came off the road and they were absolutely on fire.
Sure.
Making that record was really exciting, because when we'd send them out to do a take, and that Gar would deliver these just outrageous performances, and it was really exciting.
Sure. How did you know? What was it that you heard that made you know it was a hit, worthy enough to change your whole life to make it?
Yeah, I don't know. I just heard the stuff, and I've never had that feeling. I never had that feeling again.
Wow. It's
the only time I've ever had that. I knew this was the one. I knew this one was special. And, the songs were great. And,
sure,
it was Gar and Chris Poland and Dave Ellison playing this stuff. Those guys were all, and Mustaine, they were just brilliant, and they were so tight off of the road, and hearing that stuff live and just perform perfectly, I could hear it. This was something special, something different. And of course the album stands on its own,
Sure does.
What made you then, once the success of that album hit in, what made you then continue to stay in Hollywood and continue, to now produce more records when, I mean, instead of saying, okay, I did this record, I hit my grand slam here, I'm going to go back to computer science, major in college and leave Hollywood again. Did it reignite that spark, that fire to stick within the business again and continue to, produce the records you did?
Well, it's just, I had some success, it was a big deal. And, I had a lot of offers to make records. And so I just started working. The work just came and I just, went from record to record then. Before that, I didn't necessarily, I wasn't working as steady as that.
Okay.
And there would be times where I'd go a month without doing a record or more than a month without doing a record. And so, no, I think it was just a success of it. It's super satisfying and exciting and rewarding to be a part of something like that.
Sure.
I mean, it was really an amazing experience to be in the studio with those guys. So, it brought the magic back. I mean, it was amazing.
Yeah, no, absolutely, no doubt. Well, I mean, we could talk about that record all day long, but there's so much stuff you do. I want to get to a couple other bands you worked with that really, and these are bands we've kind of mentioned already. The first being Crumb. Let's start with them, who, in my opinion, I think may have been the most skilled musicians within that crossover scene. I mean, and then to me, of course, they're the band that really made the absolute complete hard turn in their sound. No one did that in that crossover, scene, I think, than the Crumbsuckers did with Beast on My Back right after Life of Dreams. Those records are so different. If it wasn't for Chris Notaro's, unique voice and vocal style, I don't think there's any way that people would know it's the same band. I mean, they went from this unique, classic sort of hardcore sound to now a progressive crossover, one. I mean, which made obviously many hardcore purists among the band's earlier fan base were not very happy with the change in direction on that record, especially once they heard the intro to Breakout with that piano piece. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going to guess that part might have been placed in there purposely to sort of let the fans know, hey, get ready for something completely something entirely different. Because it sounds nothing like Life of Dreams. But I'm also one of the very few who actually thinks that record, Beast on My Back, is better than Life of Dreams. I think that record's phenomenal. But to a lot of the purist hardcore fans and crossover fans, there was a lot of pushback and they didn't like it. So take us back to the studio during the recording process of that record, of Beast on My Back. I mean, what the band's mindset at the time, what was it? I mean, did you and the band foresee and expect, that reaction from, their fan base? I mean, did you have any part, for instance, in pushing them, I should say, in that direction, or was that entirely on them and their decision to do so?
It was entirely them. They came to the studio with an idea what they wanted to do and where they want to go. There was some discussion in the studio, but between them about should we do this or that, at certain points making decisions about what to do in a certain situation. But no, it was all them. I didn't come in. I came in and documented what it was they wanted to do. That was a pretty quick session too. I think we did the whole record in a week.
Wow.
In New York.
Damn.
And it was just record the stuff, get out. And that was the end of it. So
yeah. Well, that's, like I said, that's I think a phenomenal record that you were part of. Absolutely. But the other band I want to talk about was Excel. They were another band that I thought really had amazing potential, especially when the Joke's on You came out in '89. A very underrated album and band, obviously straight out of the Venice, LA scene, as we said. And that also featured a very underrated musician and guitarist, Adam Siegel. I mean, he did some amazing things on that record and just in general with that band. Of course, he wound up later, playing with Infectious Grooves during their prime years. But to me, that band, I think, really could have been huge if they, I mean, and not to put him down or anything, because he's an excellent frontman, but Dan Clements, I think he was just, I think, limited vocally. And I think if they had someone who had maybe some more range, that band could have really taken off. I thought they had such a perfect blend of, like you said, it was really a rock band with all these other, thrash or hardcore elements. And then by the time The Joke's on You came out, that was definitely had more of that groove, which was starting to become the big thing there in the late, 80s, right in the beginning, early 90s there, when you had bands like Pantera and Prong, taking over that groove metal scene. I mean, why do you think they were a band that just didn't make it bigger than they did, in your opinion? I mean, do you agree that maybe it was the vocal limits that prevented them to doing so? I mean, just give me your take on why you thought that was a band that just didn't really take off like they probably should have.
Yeah, I don't know. That was a really tough one. Like, the music business is really terrible. You can do everything right. You can do everything right and perform right and really lay down something beautiful and have it not go anywhere. So why it didn't go anywhere, I really don't know. I do think it's an underrated band. I do think they were really, really good. I really enjoyed making those records. Those records were really fantastic to make. Really fun, interesting people in that band. So very creative, and yeah, we had a great time. We had a great time making those records.
Very cool.
So I certainly love the stuff and really like it still. So, but
Sure.
I don't know. I don't know why.
It's one of those things.
Why
I guess.
something goes somewhere it doesn't.
Sure.
Right.
True.
Certainly.
Well,
go ahead, Randy.
there just is talking about how some bands, don't make it. One of the bands I worked with one day was Jet Boy. I don't know if you guys know who Jet Boy is, the hair band, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Stomping down in the bricks. Yeah.
I did their the demos, and we did 12 songs, recorded 12 songs with the vocals and the guitar overdubs, and mixed them in one night. We started around noon one day and finished around 8 or 9 in the morning the next day. So I don't know, what are the 18 hours anyway.
Right.
Those guys, their career got messed up because their A&R guy was sleeping with the lead singer in the Pandoras. That boy got signed by the same label as the Pandoras. I think it was Asylum. I'm not sure. It was a major label. Right. And their A&R guy got fired because he was sleeping with the lead singer from the band. And they just got hung out to dry for years. And it's like, here's a band that does everything right. They put together the band, they write the songs, they play the clubs, they get the attention, they record some demos, they get a major label deal, and then that's it. Nothing happens after that. So anyway.
Yeah. No, it's
Hollywood evil.
Yes, it is.
It
is.
Randy, another band that, and probably the oddest that I see when I look at your catalog, that just jumps out at me, just because it just doesn't fit anything else. Bang Tango. I mean, so much of your stuff is heavy stuff, and then all of a sudden, Bang Tango comes in there, and not only do they come in there, but when you did Dancing on Coals, that is it's an odd Bang Tango record too. I mean, it definitely has way more funk than I think they had previously. They were a little more hair metal-y on the record before. Just seems like it was a leap away from all of your previous work. So what was the attraction to working with them?
Well, like the Jet Boy, one of the things at some point I was getting a little bit burnt out only doing extreme metal.
Sure.
All the bands were starting to, the stuff that they were saying, here's the bands that you can produce. The management company would come to me with demos, right? And say, pick one of these and produce them, So I was looking to do stuff that was more like, Guns N' Roses or Jet Boy or Bang Tango. So
sure.
The management company came up and said, hey, you want to do this? Here's one you could do. And that was a very strange record, though. The way we went about that. So it was a live in the studio kind of thing.
Okay.
And But no, I was just looking to do other stuff, and I was not successful at getting other gigs outside of extreme metal. I had a jacket for doing, I was the Megadeth guy, and anybody that wasn't Megadeth didn't really want me to do them. So,
right. Was that disappointing to you? Was that disappointing to you that you? I mean,
yeah, it was.
it's weird to have something as successful as that also be a hindrance to your career, I guess.
Well, yeah, but you gotta remember that most extreme metal bands aren't Megadeth.
Yeah,
True.
it's true. Good point. Yeah.
Megadeth was phenomenal, and most of the stuff they were bringing me was mediocre. A lot of the stuff was fairly mediocre. There were exceptions, like Creator,
Sure.
that were really fantastic bands, but a lot of the stuff in the late 80s was starting to sound the same. It was like anyway,
Makes sense. Yeah.
you listen to 10 demos and you might get 10 bad ones,
Right.
you might get your hand in the bunch. So
Right, definitely. Well, Randy, obviously now 2022, we're in the age of nostalgia now. It's been long enough since that era where everything is on a list, everything is, nostalgic now. And when you see your records, a lot of your records referenced online in polls, all this stuff, it's always at the top of the very iconic lists. You look at a best thrash thing and 2 or 3 of your records always pop up. Best death metal type stuff and the death record, Scream Bloody Gore, is always near the top, if not the top. Obviously Peace Sells is, what was that, Rolling Stones top 5 or something, some crazy high number like that. And certainly Creator, Coma of Souls, is one of those records that people love to death. With all that said, how does that make you feel as the guy that was kind of formulating that stuff now? When you see it now, do you look at it and like beat your chest like, yeah, that's me, God damn it? or are you past it to the point now where it's like, okay, that was a time in my life, but now we're here?
Well, when I first started getting back into music a few years ago, I was really surprised at how important some of those records turned out to be.
Okay.
Because, at the time, I mean, I knew Megadeth was going to be a big record, but certainly Possessed, nobody thought that was going to be a big record. Nobody made any noise about that when we first did that one. It took a long time. And Death was just another, it was a good one, but it was just another thrash metal record that we did during that period. Okay. Or at least it seemed like, it was, I was grinding them out,
Right.
So, no, I consider myself to be really, really fortunate to have been in the right place at the right time and have gotten to work with all of those tremendous bands, because it really is the bands that are the greatness. Without the band, I mean, producers are nothing. We just make it. We just capture it. We don't make them great. So I was just very fortunate.
Yeah, no doubt.
And yeah,
absolutely. Just one more band you worked with, quick. I got to bring up because they're so unique. And you mentioned before is Ludacris. Who eventually obviously became Scatterbrain, shortly after that. And they were one of those bands, and it was such a unique time because they went with that, the whole humorous approach rather than that serious side of things in the crossover and metal scene. Obviously, as we said before, SOD was the first one, I think, to really bring that sort of goofiness and silliness to the music that was normally very serious in nature in terms of its lyrics. Then you had Peter Steele from, Carnivore did the same thing with that. And it seemed like it was a bit more of a New York East Coast thing, although Suicidal started to do that too when Lights, Camera, Revolution came out about 1990. I mean, how much did that, I guess that album, the SOD album, change sort of the landscape for that crossover sound and movement and influence, other bands to maybe adapt more of a fun and silly approach rather than a more pissed off and, cynical approach? I mean, did labels and studio folks, like yourself, ever try to, I mean, I know you said you're more, you document bands. You really didn't, encourage them a lot what to do, but were they sort of, encouraged maybe by the labels and so forth, since that, that sound of, I should say that those lyrics and that approach definitely had more of a mainstream appeal. It would be easier to sort of get on an MTV and a radio because it wasn't angry and hostile and, was more listener friendly. I mean, in fact, Scatterbrain, in fact, that's what happened to them. They were all over MTV and a lot of those video music channels for a while. I think it was because they adapted more of that fun style. Talk a little bit about that point in time when those bands were starting to get a little goofy and silly with their lyrics.
Well, let me just say first that Ludacris is one of the favorite records that I ever made. I love that record. When I tell people who don't know anything about metal or anything about punk, who don't know anything about that era, and I want to play them something that I recorded, I'll throw on Most People Are Dicks and say, here's something I did. Yeah. Great. This is really good, and it still is. The album was brilliant. Those guys were also the most fun in the studio, I think, of any band that I ever recorded. Wow. We had the best time, and that was one of the best experiences I ever had. So, personally, I have no idea why they went with the humor thing. I'm glad they did. I thought it was great, and really they were musically, it was pretty. There was a lot of metal in there. It was pretty hard, but from a personality point of view, it was really punk. That's the way I saw it. It's like these guys were, fuck you, we're not, fuck the rules, we're going to do whatever the fuck we want, and we don't give a shit what you think,
Right.
And that's the sort of essence of punk rock is fuck you, we don't care what you think, this is what we're going to do. And they did it better than anybody, and so there's an album that I think it was really, really underrated and should have been huge and wasn't. I don't understand why that record wasn't bigger than it was.
I agree.
Right on.
Yeah, it's a great record. I totally agree. Yeah. Well, one of the really more interesting things in your career is that, this is that you've worked now on the two songs that over the years were the only songs I could think of where Metallica was ever accused of ripping off. The first, of course, being Dark Angels, Darkness Descends with Lars Ulrichs. He's been accused, obviously, of ripping off Gene Hoglan's part in that song for the Metallica song One. And then Kirk Hammett was sort of accused of ripping off the intro riff to Excel's, tapping into the emotional void for that main riff and intro to Enter Sandman. Now, in my opinion, the Dark Angel drum piece, I'm just going to leave it as I think it's pretty obvious. I do think that's a bit of a steal, if you want to say that. Now, as the Enter Sandman riff, there's some similarities to that, but overall, I think it's just one of those deals where, there's just going to be riffs and parts of songs that are always going to sound like something else, and I think it's just a coincidence on that one. And we even talked to Greg Sines about that last year, and he said that whole controversy with that song was created by pretty much by the former management. They just tried to cash in a little bit on the success of Enter Sandman at the time. But as a guy who is responsible for tracking both of those songs, what's your take on both of those? I mean, because if anyone could spot the similarities and differences, I would have to assume you'd be the guy to let us know in on that.
Well, I think I would come into the camp of that. Some things are just going to sound like other things. I can't imagine Metallica going, hey, here's a great riff. Let's write a song with this riff. These guys have so much creativity. Why would they? It just doesn't make any sense for me to go there. And it's quite possible, though, they could have heard it and then 6 months later played something and not remembered that it sounded like something already. I heard an interview a few months ago with Jacob Dylan, Bob Dylan's son.
And Wallflowers.
Wallflowers, yeah. And they asked him about songwriting, and he said, and they asked him about a particular song. There was some song that he had written that sounded like something else. And he said, I write a song that somebody else wrote probably every day, and it goes, but I usually know it. And like, oh, wait a minute, somebody already did that one. I can't use that one. Is that happens all the time. And I think that probably happens with metal bands as well, is that they come up with a riff and it's like they don't realize that it's already on another record somewhere.
Sure.
Or that they heard it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's on another record somewhere. So I don't think there was any malice or evil or misrepresentation in that. I think it was probably just an accident.
Sure. I have to imagine for you as a producer, you probably hear things that sound something like something else that you worked on all the time, no?
Well, yeah, at the time, a lot of the stuff did sound there were a lot of things that sound really similar. That's true. In those records. So I think it would be very easy for a band to accidentally do something that sounds a lot like another band.
Certainly, man. Well, Randy, I would be remiss to let you go without asking you about this one last record, that of course being the Grandpa Death Experience. What can you tell me about this? What can you tell me about this record?
Well, it was Ron Gowdy, who unfortunately the late Ron Gowdy, he passed away in 2020. Ron was the guy who came to me and said, how much to do this punk record? And I said, I need $500 this week in order to keep the studio open. Otherwise, I'm closing it down and we're moving out. Right. He said, okay, I'll give you $500 and you do my punk record. I said, fine. So that's where I started with Ron Gowdy was Hell Comes to Your House. And we were friends for, forever.
Sure.
We were still friends until the very end. And he was in Amsterdam. He did the record. It's him and some friends in Amsterdam. And he asked me to mix one song. I mixed one of the songs. There are a bunch of other pretty famous guys that mixed the other songs too.
Sure.
He did a lot of records. He knew a lot of people in the music business. So it's just something I did for my friend Ron.
Very cool.
And I miss him a lot. I gotta tell you.
I'll bet.
Yeah.
Yeah, no question, man. Well, Randy, your career is legendary, and I know you know that, but we'll say it anyway. Your career is absolutely legendary. I think just between me and Matt alone, we've probably built you at least a garage on your house just in stuff that we've bought that your name is on, man. But dude, this has really been fun chatting with you and learning so much about these records, man. It's really good.
Yeah. Okay, well, let me just put a plug in there.
Sure.
I'm back in the music business. I'm doing
great.
I've got I finally got a room with proper acoustics where I can monitor and mix. And I just did an album. I just mixed an album for a band called Leatherwolf. I actually recorded their first album in 1983 at Music Grinder.
Wow.
And they saw something on Facebook that I was mixing now and called me up, and I ended up doing their album. It came out great. But anyway, I'm looking for bands to mix. I've been working up to it for a number of years now, learning Pro Tools and learning how to do the stuff and learning how to mix in the box, and then trying to get a monitoring situation. And I finally have that together. So I'm looking for work. So I expect that there are DIY bands out there that are making their own records and need somebody to mix it. I'm available.
All right. Well, where do we tell them to go to get to you?
Look me up on Facebook. Hit me up on Facebook. Look for Randy Burns Producer, and they can hit me there, or randyburnsmusic@gmail.com.
Okay.
So, but they should be able to find me on Facebook, and they can DM me there.
Very good. Great. Well, everybody definitely do that, especially you bands. We know about 1 million bands that listen. So hopefully some of them will hear this and hit you up, Randy. And Randy, obviously, man, this has been a great pleasure, man. We definitely appreciate the time.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks a lot, Randy. Appreciate it.
All right.
When it's time to rock, it's time to tune in to Crash Course Radio. featuring the very best of the heavier music, from Slayer to Clutch to Fear Factory. It's all in one place, Crash Course Radio. To tune into Crash Course Radio, simply visit www.cmsradio.net. You can also tune in on the CMS Network app by opening the app, clicking the musical notes at the top right corner, and selecting Crash Course Radio from our stations. All the best heavy music is there, so you should be too. Ditch the commercial radio and make Crash Course Radio your everyday station.